listeners, welcome to Fitness Junk Debunked. I'm your host, Steph Dykstra. I'm here today with Helen Coleus, who is ILT's resident expert, Dr. Helen Coleus. And I'm also here with Ron Dykstra, our co-founder and program director. I almost forgot about the person sitting next to me. And today our special guest is Maggie Wente, who's also an ILT member. Maggie, thank you for joining us. Do you want to tell
us for having me
about yourself and your connection to ILT?
Sure. So I've been an ILT member for a few years now, and I started coming to kettlebell classes a year or so before that. And yeah, I've been very excited and happy to be a part of the community because you have made a wonderful community that is curious and respectful. And, so I've been really happy to be a part of it.
Amazing.
Happy to have you, for sure.
And Maggie, what do you do?
Oh, I am a lawyer, and I work for First Nations and First Nations controlled organizations, if you will, political organizations and governments generally. And I have a pretty broad practice area, but I tend to focus a little bit on Aboriginal rights and a lot on equality for children and equality in social services or access to social services for Indigenous children or in communities generally as well.
Wow. One of the thousands of reasons why I love Maggie. Maggie also introduced me to some amazing mangoes, which are pretty phenomenal. And they're pretty amazing.
I have a problem.
Because they're in season, and Helen taught us all about that. If you haven't taken a look at how to get the tastiest fruits, you can check our Instagram or our Facebook page for some tips from Helen on picking things in season. So we know that it's Pride Month, but it's also National Indigenous History Month. So my question is, what does that mean? Like, what do we do during National Indigenous History Month? Like we learn, we celebrate, we broaden what we know about Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, Métis people. What does that mean for you, Maggie?
Oh, it's funny actually to think about what it means for me. I'm not actually sure which came first, the chicken or the egg. No, the National Indigenous History Month or the Indigenous Solidarity Day, which is not a national holiday, but is celebrated on June 21st, which is also the summer solstice. So for quite a while now, that's been sort of National Aboriginal Day. I don't know if they changed the name to Indigenous, and then I think, it became a month because everybody gets a month, which I was laughing about the other day because my child informed me that it's also National Potty Training Awareness Month.
Oh,
so okay. No person left behind is what I say. So for me, I mean, I come from a mixed family, but my mom's side of the family is Anishinaabe which is Ojibwe, from the North Shore of Lake Huron, a place called Serpent River First Nation. My grandmother was a residential school survivor. She passed away when I was in my early 20s. So I'm pretty immersed in these issues and in the communities that I work with and the communities, my social communities and stuff. To me, I don't know, you might feel the same way about Black History Month stuff. Like, to me, I sort of feel like it's a month that's like contains with it some obligation, I suppose, to attempt to try to kind of educate people or build solidarity. It's nice. Like, I do think that, it's good for people to have their attention be drawn to Indigenous history, and particularly this year, given that the month kind of started off with the discovery of the 215 children's bodies at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. That's something that I hope people will take with them throughout the month and, commit themselves to learning about Indigenous issues. But, I can't say that I feel like super celebratory at any given time.
That makes a lot of sense. And again, thank you for talking to us about what happened, because that really shocked a lot of people. There was a camp of people that were shocked and a camp of people that weren't shocked. And then I would like to say that there was another camp of people, and I'm in this camp. I guess I have limbs in both camps, where I was embarrassed to not know what was happening in the country that I live in. So there was embarrassment. not so much shocked, like nothing really shocks me in terms of policy and colonial policy, but that's going to take us into this episode, which is episode 6 of Fitness Junk Debunked, and it's Indigenous health and the residential school system. So thank you for being a part of this safe space for us to be curious, ask questions, and we know that we're not going to get into, I always say into the thick of it now because that's like a trending song that I hear all the time. It's been remixed 10,000 different ways. But you're not gonna learn everything on this podcast. You're gonna learn a little bit, tiny bit on this video recording and podcast. And you shared with me a presentation you did for your kids' school, whereby it's kind of understood that it's up to us to continue to learn daily beyond this month. And I feel that way about other months as well, where it's like, this is the month and everybody tries to like cram for it. And it's like, well, you can't, that's not how continued education works. You have to continue to do the work, which it's like fitness in that way. You have to be consistent. You have to work on habits that will help you understand the world around you and better connect with community. So again, I'm not going to stop. I'm so honored and grateful that you're helping.
You thanked me so many times. It's like you're from Nova Scotia. People from Nova Scotia are always like, thank you, I'm sorry.
So I think I will hand it back to you, Maggie, and I guess let's talk about the history and the present day of residential school systems and their impact.
Sure. I mean, I appreciate that you're kind of just giving me an open platform. I'll try to do as much as I can in the time we have. Yeah, so I mean, to start with your comment that you said, like, you sort of felt ashamed. I think that is something, or like guilty that you didn't know all of these things. And sure, like, I think that that's an appropriate feeling. I think it's appropriate to feel uncomfortable about the fact that you didn't know these things, particularly because we had a whole royal commission called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which released a report in 2015, which was many, many volumes, which kind of detailed things about the horrors of the residential school system. And for whatever reason, there were lots of public hearings. There were hearings in which residential school survivors shared their stories. There was archival research. There was this 7-volume report, which I appreciate is, maybe a bit much for most people. And there was a bit of media coverage, but for whatever reason, I think in some circles that really resonated and people paid attention, but I do think that there was a huge amount of non-attention to it, right? Like within mainstream media, or bringing people's minds, bringing that to the forefront of people's minds. And other than that, I mean, I think, this is not something that is particularly well covered in schools. As certainly when we were going to school, this is like not something that people talked about. So, I mean, I'm a pretty resilient person and like very happy to chat with people about this. And so I'm happy to kind of be asked to do this. It was the same reason why I put my hand up and said to my kids' school, because I'd asked them, like, did you talk about Kamloops this week? Did you talk about residential school? And they were like, no. And I was like, so I emailed the school right away because it's not well covered in the curriculum. The current government, I think, kind of reduced or canceled the sort of updated curriculum on Indigenous issues. So I'm not sure that we'll be able to expect that it's going to get covered super well there. And people have discomfort. Teachers have discomfort teaching this curriculum, I think, probably, or teaching whatever, resources they have. So like there's people who are shocked. I wonder sometimes if that shock is actually more or at least partially an expression of the kind of grief or guilt or surprise and sadness that people feel about the fact that like they didn't know this, that obviously we all benefit from a colonial system, one sort of pillar of which was residential schools, etc. I try to be forgiving some days as much as I can. I try to be forgiving about people's shock and sort of desire to emote about it. I mean, other times not so much, like, because I'm sure you can imagine, because this is like, seems to have been sort of the last 16 months, a lot of discourse about sort of race and colonialism issues. But like, when Susan from kindergarten is like reaching out to me asking to talk, I'm like, I don't have time, Susan.
Right.
Okay, but anyway, all of that to say, this is for Susan. Susan citizens of the world can learn in this. So I think the kinds of things that I want to explain or like think about in terms of the history of the residential school system is one thing that I think is like important to debunk, if we're here to debunk things, is that this is not something that happened in the very, very distant past. This is something that happened where the last residential school closed in 1996. So like that's after I started university. I have friends who are my age who went to residential school. And, as I say, my grandmother went to residential school, and there's lots of present day sort of living survivors here. The system kind of had its roots in the sort of 1820s, 1830s, but it really took hold in the just kind of post-Confederation. There were a bunch of education studies, including probably people know this now because of the toppling of the statue outside Ryerson University. But Egerton Ryerson, a historical figure who purported to do this study about proper education for all Canadian children, and is hailed, I think, as being sort of the founder of public education. He had recommended that there be publicly funded education for all children in Canada, but he also had recommended that there be separate schools for First Nations children for a variety of reasons. And he's not the only one. There's a lot of different people who, were advocates and architects of the residential school system. But and they really started kind of opening up like in the 1860s, 1870s. And, the former Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, his point is what he said about the school system was basically to remove Indigenous or First Nations children from their families, remove them from their parents, and that is the only way to assimilate them, to make them think and act like white people. And there were statements that Duncan Campbell Scott, I think it was, who's a historical figure, like this Indian agent guy who was like running around First Nations communities, he said that the purpose of the school was to kill the Indian in the child. And so what's interesting to me is, despite all of this evidence, there are still kind of residential school denialists all over the place who are like, well, maybe they were just trying to give people a school and a place to go. And, the parents wanted this. It was, there's some treaty provisions in about education in some of the treaties and whatever. But I mean, that may be true that people wanted education, First Nations people wanted education for their children, but they certainly, I don't think, understood that the premise of the system was to kill the Indian in the child or, entirely assimilate First Nations folks. So the schools kind of sort of around the turn of the century, 1896, there were around 60 schools. And then in 1920, so like that's just 100 years ago, right? Like I think, again, this tendency to be like, this was so far in the past, it's right. Not. Mm-hmm. That's when the schools became mandatory. And so what happened there is the government kind of contracted with various churches, primarily the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, to run the schools. And in 1920, the schools became mandatory, and that's when people were authorized to go onto the reserves and forcibly remove the children from their parents and take them in. And that happened for kids sometimes as young as 3. It was supposed to, I think, theoretically be for kids around 5 and stay till they're 16. Some children were big, right? Like I remember talking to someone I know who works in or lives in a community where I was working, and he said, well, I was a tall kid, and so they took me and I was 3. And he ran away many, many times over the course of his time in school because he didn't want to be there. And sometimes people were allowed to go home in summer to see their families. Not always. It was like sort of at the whim of the church and the state. And sometimes they went home sort of at Christmas holiday, but again, not always. And that's sort of, they became unmandatory again at some period, but the school still existed until 1996, as I say. And then they were introduced into the Inuit communities only in the 50s. And so that's sort of kind of the progression of them. And there were also things called day schools. There were a bunch of different varieties of church or state-run schools, which Indigenous children were taken away. In the day schools, they went home at night, but they were also sort of a place where abuse was experienced. So the kind of defining features of life at the schools, as far as we know, is that there was widespread maltreatment of the children. There's many accounts of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse by the people running the school. Always that there was not enough food and that children were hungry, and we're going to circle back to that one later, right?
Right.
And they didn't get adequate medical care. There were nutritional experiments and other kinds of medical experiments conducted on children. And there was there were accounts of people being killed by the children being killed by the staff or beaten by the staff to the point of death and being buried on the grounds, which is what we hear about at Kamloops now.
So at this point in time in this system, people were speaking out about this, but the government was like, that's not a thing. And the Catholic Church was basically like, people are dying of tuberculosis, rather than stating what was really happening. So it wasn't just like this was happening and nobody knew and nobody was saying anything. People were coming forward and speaking about the massive traumas that were happening at the time.
Sure, there were a couple sort of brave souls who had gone around. So there was a doctor named Dr. Bryce, and he had gone to do a review of the schools, and he had noted that even within the schools, like present day student body would have like a 25% death rate, and that children often died shortly after leaving the schools, like had a premature death. Up to sometimes 70% of children would have premature deaths after leaving the schools.
70%, that's huge.
Yeah, and then as you say, like generally the deaths were recorded as being tuberculosis related, which is funny because I actually was like reading on Twitter the other day of just a historian had posted, because he had posted and he said, I study disease and prison history, and he was like, there was never a 25% death rate from tuberculosis in any prison around the same amount of time. And you would imagine, in some senses, similar conditions. So, it stands to reason that other things are going on. And certainly the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had found that they knew of 4,100 children in Canada who had died while they were at the school, but they have estimated, and the person who was the chair of that commission, Justice Murray St. Clair, he thinks maybe if we start doing this work, we're going to maybe find, kind of up to 25,000 bodies of children buried in unmarked graves on the grounds. And then the other really primary feature, which is, not everybody experienced emotional abuse or sexual abuse or physical abuse necessarily, but the kind of overwhelming experience was that when you went, you were made to not practice any spiritual traditions you had. You were not allowed to speak your Indigenous language, and you were told that you were inferior all of the time. You were made to feel ashamed, and nobody loved you. And so, as it turns out, now we know this causes extraordinary kind of future effects in the psychology of people who went to those schools and their children and grandchildren, which we call intergenerational trauma. And also, we also now know really kind of new stuff that I don't know too much about, but the study of epigenetics is this, tells us that I guess genetic markers of trauma can like basically implant yourself in the DNA of a people or of a person and get passed down through generations, so that there's in fact sort of physical long-term effects of this trauma. But like at its most basic, people would say, if you really want to boil it down, like, how you learn to be a parent is by how you were parented. And some people make choices to parent differently than their own parents. But no one who went to residential school has really learned how to be parented and how to be a parent. And so when it came time for them to have their own families, this continues to sort of cause effects, and trauma as we go down. And then also, as we know, people in all, demographic groups who experience abuse are often then perpetrators of abuse themselves. And we have all kinds of health effects that have rolled out from residential school, which, all kind of continue today to some extent in any Indigenous person's family.
Right. That it's horrifying and horrible and terrible and deplorable, all the words. One of the things that, there's several things, but one of the things that leapt out at me was, in these residential schools, a lot of the children were starving.
Yeah.
So they were starving and also made to do hard labor. So these were children who weren't eating, hungry bellies, and forced to do labor. And it was it was spun to make it seem like it was an Indigenous problem and not a colonial policy problem. In terms of taking land where Native people grew food or hunted food, making hunting and trapping policies, and things of that nature. Would you care to expand on that a little bit more? Or
Yeah, so I mean, for sure there was, I think, what we've read now in the historical research that's been done about nutritional experiments, there was certainly, I think, some kind of zeitgeist around the medical population or the colonizer population, that health problems that Indigenous people experience either at the schools or after were a result of their poor genetics and not a result of anything else. But the school, as you pointed out, the schools are just kind of one pillar of a huge sort of edifice of colonialism. And a lot of that colonialism, you're quite right, resulted in Indigenous people being deprived of their traditional ways of living, their traditional recreational practices, their traditional foods, and their ability to kind of sustain themselves as they have on this land forever. Right. So, one of the things, for instance, that the government did in the prairies is they did this thing called clearing the plains, right? They kind of got rid of buffalo populations or bison populations, which was the foods of the Plains Cree, and offered in exchange, or said, well, you better go live on these reserves now, and we'll provide you food on the reserves now. Changing the way that the traditional economies worked. So trying to encourage people to farm and settle land as opposed to hunt. Banning hunting, and that's something that continues to this day. I have a hunting trial about caribou hunting in Labrador right now for the Innu, who have lived and hunted caribou for millennia and millennia in Labrador. And when they have those, traditional food and recreation sources and confining people to reserves, basically you're changing and getting rid of their entire culture. But a lot of it centers on foods in reality.
Right. So if you're listening, make sure you have some water and hunker down. I know this is tough stuff to listen to, but it's important, and it's important to broaden your perspective on what's happening in our country around us. And like, some of you might be thinking, what does this have to do with Fitness Junk Debunked? So we know about the recent news about the residential schools, and we are acknowledging the experience and the environment of people exposed to that in early life and how that affects health overall. So that's mental health, physical health, spiritual health, being denied access to who you are, your roots, but also like just disconnecting you and not loving you, which is a part of pride, is like loving somebody for who they are openly and not having to hide that, which we talked about in our previous episode. But circling back to what we're talking about now, we kind of touched on the Canada Food Guide. So this is, like I said, there's a lot to talk about, but Canada Food Guide, we all grew up on it. When were you introduced to the Canada Food Guide, Ron?
Elementary school. Second grade, maybe.
Yeah. How about you, Helen?
Yeah, sometime in elementary school, but it's a bit hazy. But yeah, sometime during elementary school.
Right, and it was like, you got so much of dairy, so much of wheat products, so much of meat. And then they changed that in, was it 2013, Helen?
2019. It wasn't until 2019.
It was changed. And Helen, why was it changed?
Why was it changed? Well, I think it wasn't actually that much research based, and it wasn't working. I think is kind of the bottom line. If you looked at what people were eating, it wasn't working, and they it was actually interesting that they actually isolated the people that were working on it from any political groups. And there was some people that were a little upset that they didn't have influence on it. So it's a more neutral, politically independent guide than it was before. And it moved away from, you know, like meat and dairy to like, hey, there's vegetarian options, there's vegan options. So it's kind of more accessible to different ethnicities, right? So there's people for religious reasons or whatever reasons they don't eat meat, and so that or animal products, so allows for that. And it shifted towards, you know, eating more mindfully, eating more protein, lean protein, wherever the source of protein is, eating less processed food. This probably sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Eating more vegetables and fruits. So you know, arguably, it's if you talk to anybody's great grandmother, she'd be like, yeah. like this is not a surprise, like wherever in the world. So I think it went to a more, I think, culturally neutral place and more actually driven by actual research,
right?
Which is a bit what's the word, given what we will hear about with what happened with the original Canada Food Guide, seems kind of even more tragic,
right?
Yeah.
So what we're going to get into now, and what Helen's segueing to, is the origin of the Canada Food Guide and what it was based on, which I'm going to be perfectly honest, I didn't learn until last night at 11:30 p.m.
Yeah, I had no idea either. Like
Maggie said,
yeah, I mean, look, neither did I, and I'm no expert. So I mean, I know because my friend, this historian Ian Mosby, kind of found this stuff out. So
right. So Maggie sent an article, and we took a look at it last night, and it just changed the direction we were taking with this podcast. And I think in a good way. It's a harder turn, but I think it's in a good way. So again, I'm gonna, because your friend put you onto the research behind what we're gonna talk about next, I'm gonna turn it back to Maggie, and we're gonna talk about where they got the intel for the Canada Food Guide that we all grew up and were introduced to in elementary school.
So at least in part, they got some of the intel from experiments on children in residential schools in the 40s and 50s. And so apparently the sort of founder of the Canada Food Guide, and as I say, I'm no expert in this, but you know, I've read a little bit about it. The founder of the Canada, or creator of the Canada Food Guide, had some questions when they were kind of thinking about foods and things, and they had a great, and obviously sarcastic, a great research ground in residential schools, because there were children who were starving and malnourished there. Because, as I said before, I think one of the things that all kids who went to residential school would say was that there was never enough food. And so the kids were malnourished, and they conducted certain kinds of experiments on them, like fortifying flours, or like why are people anemic, or doing all these kinds of things, which resulted in blood tests. So how this came about, or how this research came about, is I think that there had been some discussion of it quite a while ago, but there's a gentleman named Ian Mosby, who's a professor at Ryerson University. At the time, he wasn't a professor. I think he might have actually still been doing his doctoral research or his postdoctoral research, and he's a food historian. He had nothing to do with Indigenous issues, etc. But while he was doing his research, he discovered all of these records about these experiments on children. And this is sort of in 2005, 2006 that he's finding this stuff. And found records about the nutritional experiments that they were doing, and how that led to the Canada Food Guide, because he was looking at stuff about the Canada Food Guide, and he does stuff about wartime gardens. And, you know, remarkably and wonderfully, he followed that path. That, you know, it wasn't the path that he was trying to do for the research that he was doing at the time, but he said, I have to find out more about this. And it became kind of, I think, something that, like, surely he could not have expected. And I think lots of people couldn't expect, but it was actually a very welcome thing to kind of uncover, I think, because there are people who had those experiments conducted on them who are still alive, who live in communities. And, you know, Ian was able to visit those communities after the research was made public And, you know, a lot of communities brought him in to tell their members, the older people, what had happened to them. Because they knew, I'm sure, as children, that something weird was happening to them. But all of this, of course, was conducted without the consent of any of the parents, et cetera, and led to kids getting further sick because they were kind of, in some case I read there was an instance where they were trying to test about anemia and children ended up more anemic, and they're like, shrug, that's okay. But yeah, it's so that's super strange. I mean, there's a whole movement again called like Indigenous food sovereignty, which is this desire to kind of have Indigenous people kind of be able to go back and think about what traditional foods were and reinstitute some of those practices, like which is really remarkable, but I mean, and in many ways still very, very controlled by the state for lots of reasons, one of which, for instance, I work on this caribou hunting trial in Newfoundland and Labrador, and they've banned caribou hunting there for conservation reasons. And the, you know, who knows why the caribou are in decline. Caribou populations go really up and down historically, and there's certainly been caribou famines in the past, but you know, there's also declining caribou populations because of climate change and habitat loss, et cetera. Anyway, point being, my clients aren't allowed to hunt caribou, which is, I will say, literally the core of their existence. Everything in their life traditionally, until they were settled in the 50s, was caribou. Their clothes, their shoes, their vehicles, their homes, their food, everything was revolving around caribou, and that entire way of life has been removed from them because of hunting bans being imposed for conservation purposes. But there are lots of movements to try to kind of restore and think about traditional food systems, et cetera. But it is a big part of the colonial policy, is to just remove those kinds of things from people. And people have health effects. If you look at the elders in the communities I work with who grew up on the land, and let's talk about growing up on the land, like you're walking, you know, thousands of kilometers every winter, every day, making your tent, you're hunting, you're doing all of these things, you're leading an extremely active lifestyle. And the elders in that community, I mean, they're fit, right? Like they've spent their whole lives eating caribou and you know, not a lot else. There's, if you just eat a traditional diet in Labrador, there isn't a lot else. There's some fish sometimes and little birds and other kinds of critters, porcupine and stuff. And, you know, since those communities were settled in the 50s, you know, health has really steeply declined and life expectancy has declined in those communities. And it's got a lot to do with food.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just want to interrupt briefly and say that we see this effect of colonialism all over the world.
100%.
Polynesian islands, for example, the Tongans, the Samoans, the Fijians. These people lived active, healthy lifestyles prior to colonization, and post-colonization, fast food and processed foods have basically changed the people themselves. They no longer bear much resemblance to their ancestors, and the health ramifications are direct, and we see this in Canada as well now, obviously, and everywhere colonialism has touched.
Yeah, one of the things about Ian's research that he had done or kind of drawn a link with was this suggestion that had grown in the medical community, I guess, that First Nations people are prone to diabetes. And he's like, well, sure, if you're fed crap food your whole life when you're a child and you're malnourished and then you're exposed to these things that aren't your traditional foods and experiments are conducted on you, sure, then you're prone to diabetes. But it's not a genetic thing. It's an environmental thing which has arisen because of colonialism. And you're right, you see similar stories all over the world.
So going back to these experiments, one of the things that jumped out about the article, which I have to figure out a way to post it. It's from the, is it CBC?
Yeah, it was a longer CBC. And Ian, if you look up Ian, you can see lectures of him online. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff about these experiments because it has been really widely picked up.
So the article that we're referencing is called Unreserved, The Dark History of Canada's Food Guide, How Experiments on Indigenous Children Shape Nutrition Policy. And again, these were experiments. So one of the things that leapt out about these experiments is that to do that, some kids would get a vitamin to see how they would react, let's say vitamin C, and then other kids were given a placebo. So they were actively harming the kids that were already malnourished by not giving them what they need. So they knew they were malnutritioned and they needed nutrients, they needed food, they were working hard, and they held that back in the name of proving something, again, with no permission, like zero permission. And it's like, who would give permission? So that's why they just went ahead and did what they wanted, which
Yeah.
is just, it blows my mind that this stuff can happen. But like we're saying, this is a lot of systems are affected by this. Like we've talked about, like just in our short conversation and on the little that we've touched on, we've talked about education, we've talked about medicine, we've talked about nutrition and like how food is processed. And these are just what, 3 systems? We can probably come up with more systems that are affected by colonialism policy.
Sure.
Yeah, so again, the article by the CBC, a great eye-opener, place to start. So where do we begin to unlearn? Where would you suggest that we get started, even with teaching kids, people with parents that have kids? Where can we start to begin this journey of unlearning and relearning what actually happened versus what was spun to us?
Yeah, so what's magnificent is there's actually a ton of resources. I mean, obviously there's the entire Royal Commission report, and there's a summary and stuff about what happened for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what happened. And with respect to Indigenous issues, also there's the report of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. There's no shortage of reports. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, that came out when I was in university. There's no shortage of government reports about where to learn about Indigenous people. But yeah, those aren't necessarily super accessible, I would say. But there's also movies. You can go on the National Film Board's website and watch tons and tons of documentaries about Indigenous Canada relations, some of which are very old, and some of which are brand new. Any book you read by an Indigenous author, any book has a relation to residential schools in it. But some of the ones that I've loved, a book by Richard Wagamese called Indian Horse, which is a book about residential schools, and it's a book about hockey. And it's a wonderful book. It's a bit of a gut punch, to be honest, but in some places, but it's also beautifully written. And if you're a hockey fan, I think people would really like it because it's the narrative about how hockey is played is really wonderfully written, as someone who's a non-hockey fan. But as an outsider, I loved that book. There's lots of children's books, so we'll post that kind of stuff up. But like, where do we go from here? I mean, to me, I always feel like you have to know, like G.I. Joe, knowing is half the battle, right? So you have to know what happened. And there's things we can refuse to in this country, just to kind of accept the ongoing oppression and inequality of Indigenous people, but you have to make your voice known, right? You have to let, your politicians know that this is not acceptable to you. The oppression and sort of colonialism of the world didn't end when residential schools closed. In fact, it continues onward in so many ways. So now we have child welfare, provincial and state imposed child welfare systems, which result in Indigenous kids disproportionately, way disproportionately, ending up in foster care, et cetera, and kind of repeating these traumas that exist when people are taken from their homes. And I work on a case which is about the underfunding of child welfare services, and particularly underfunding the kinds of services that keep families together, which are called prevention services in the child welfare world. And there's a lot of research about how this then results in this, they call it like the child welfare to prison pipeline, right? Like, lots of people Indigenous people are terribly over incarcerated, and there's reasons for that, sort of disproportionate sentencing and whatever, but there is also disproportionate involvement of the criminal justice system, and a lot of those people came from the child welfare system. And we just don't have equality basically for any kinds of services, for health services, for housing services, for infrastructure like drinking water services, for child welfare, for education. None of those systems are funded on the same way that they are, at the same levels that they are for non-First Nations children and families and individuals. So I always say, like, you know, we could try equality as a policy objective. That's something that's never been tried in this country before.
Right.
Which is like a bananas thing to say, but like we could try that.
Yeah.
And actually, equality is the foundation of liberal governments, or not big L liberal governments, but like small L liberal political philosophy. And I don't understand how it's not a choice that we pursue. Because to me, and I'm not a social scientist, obviously, but to me, it just seems to me like very obvious that if we tried equality for a few generations and, you know, trying to have people starting on an equal footing and continuing on an equal footing, lots of these problems might go away, you know, and then we could see what were the real persistent ones. But right now, I think kind of the way that, you know, the socioeconomic health outcomes, the inequality that Indigenous people face, people think it's like this Gordian knot that they couldn't possibly undo. Like, we just don't know what to do. It's incredibly complicated. And I'm like, okay, well, we could start here and pressure your governments to do that, right? And then for kids learning about stuff, there's an organization called the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, led by a wonderful advocate called Cindy Blackstock. And again, I'm privileged to work on a case that she's leading about child welfare equality in Canada. And she has wonderful resources for teachers. She has wonderful resources for children and parents about equality for children, and also about the residential school system and the current child welfare system, that are really accessible and helpful. And she has like a section on her website that's like 7 free ways to make a difference, etc. So, I mean, there's no shortage of stuff. You just kind of have to get curious and get into Google, right? Like,
yeah. And I noticed that in your list, it didn't say reach out to Maggie if you went to school with her in elementary school and ask her inbox, or let her know that you are one of the good ones, or, and like, this is, I guess I'm putting my own experience on this. There's a grief.
I'm sure you had this experience.
Yeah, there's a grief and there is an emotional cost. And Maggie, you're probably a lot more poised in this area than I am, because I don't speak on the issues that you do. But sometimes when we have these conversations with people who've experienced the thing that we're just learning about, we forget that that conversation affects them more so than it affects the person who's learning. So I would just say be respectful as you learn. Be respectful with how you ask your questions and to whom you ask your questions. But as Maggie astutely pointed out, there's so many resources that you can get curious on your own, and start learning the real history that we didn't learn in school.
Yeah, it's funny because I realized, of course, when this started happening last week, and like everyone from kindergarten is reaching out to empathize with me, that I'm sure I do that all the time. I'm sure I do it to other people too. And I realized kind of how it's not hurtful, it's just kind of onerous in some way. That, you know, whatever. Because then, of course, when we had the killing of the Muslim family that was an Islamophobic attack earlier this week, of course, then I'm like, now I must text all my Muslim friends to let them know that I'm with them. And then I was like, no, you don't need to do that. Like,
yeah.
But it's hard. Like, I think to me, that's like a very hard balance, because I do think that some people want to hear stuff. And certainly I love hearing from my close friends that they're thinking of me, and that's nice. But also sometimes I wonder, is this like because I'm the only Indigenous person you know? And if so, maybe think about that. Like,
and it's pretty obvious when you're in the situation, like relationship wise, what is your relationship to this person, to the person? Have you talked to them at all in the last 10 years?
Well, or even in the last year, right? Like,
you're reaching out to say, hey, sorry about the thing. I did a course, and like that one I'm kind of I read a thing. Let me tell you about it. So yes, it is National Indigenous History Month. I want to thank our guests and one of our favorite ILT members, Maggie, for joining us today. And I know you have a busy week ahead, so thank you so much, so much. We love you. I'm gonna open it up to Ron and Helen to see if they have anything to add or
I also want to thank Maggie and thank Helen for being here today. Thank you so much. I want to speak to all the white people out there who are probably assuage their guilt and get over it real quick. You know what I mean? It's not a get over it real quick type of situation. And it's okay to not know things. That doesn't mean that they didn't happen. You know what I mean? It's important to learn things and to act on them and to be the best person you can be without denying other people's lives and experiences in order for you to make yourself feel a little bit better. So I'll just put that out there because I think there's a lot of that kind of ass covering that goes on when these types of things happen to marginalized communities, whether they be Black people, Indigenous people, or whomever has been oppressed. So it's okay to not know things. It's okay to ask questions politely, respectfully. It's okay to receive new information and change your mind about things. You don't have to be who your great granddaddy said you should be. Do you know what I mean? So I'm just putting that out there for our audience members who happen to be white.
Well, I know I look very white as well. I'm reading White Fragility right now because I realize it's, we all have to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And that's the thing. It is work, and we can't shy away from it. It's work that needs to be done. It's hard work and it's painful work. You know what I mean? And it doesn't need to happen all today because obviously we're not fixing everything with this. You know what I mean? But we need to be aware and we need to be open to change. Put that out there. With my thanks to both Helen and Maggie.
Helen, do you want to thank Maggie a bunch of times too?
I really I'd like to thank Maggie too. In that, I think that for me, it is really but getting more information and then acting on this new information, going, I didn't know. And so when you know, you can do better if you didn't, so, and then actively looking for that information as well. So, and so thanks for the information and for next actions. And like Ron said, I think it's when you're, instead of being embarrassed and kind of pushing everybody away and being like, it's not my fault. I think kind of embracing this discomfort and going, well, okay, this is, it's uncomfortable. It's like, this is a horrible thing that happened. It's like, well, now what can we do to move forward?
Yeah, it is uncomfortable and we all benefit from it. We all benefit from the oppression of Indigenous people, and so do I, right? But yeah, you can do things about it. You can actively work against those benefits or work against the perpetuation of discrimination. So.
Totally. Well, this has been Fitness Junk Debunked. Today's episode 6, is Indigenous Health and the Residential School System. If you haven't listened to the first 5 episodes, I would recommend going back and listening to the episodes because we do touch on important things. Our first episode talks about listening. So if you listen to this and it didn't really sink in, our first podcast talks about the art of listening. And then you can come back to this podcast. But with our podcast, we hope that you listen to them a couple times, take notes, and learn and pass it on. So thanks again for joining us. That's what, number 50? Yeah, Canadian.
Thank you for being our local social justice gym.
I love Maggie so much. Ron and I are actually going to try to get our second vaccine. We'll see, fingers crossed that it works out. And that's because Maggie has had her back and always sends the text and is like, go here, because she cares. And it's amazing to have this caring energy in our community and in our lives. So for the 20,000th time, thank you. And I'm going to say that.
You're welcome.
Fitness Junk Debunked. And I'm going to sign off with my favorite line, cookies.
Eat pizza. Find your power in the pride.
Find your power in the pride. And we will post links and resources to some of the things that we discussed during today's podcast. Thanks so much, guests, again, and viewers, if you're watching this, if you're listening to this, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon. Our next, I got to go to the next podcast, which is on art. It is Pride Month, so we're going to discuss art next week, and our guest will be Jocelyn Reynolds.
Art and art, and we're not just discussing art, we're discussing its connection to
Pride.
to gay pride.
Yeah, for Pride. And we're also talking with Eric Rich, aka Lucy Flawless. Yeah, so we will talk with those guests next week, and we'll hopefully have you listening next week. Bye for now.
See you soon.
Bye.
Smile.